I think what we're seeing here between Israel and Gaza is really unprecedented force from Israel and really a new front in all of this with the targets of media outlets and media buildings in Gaza. What's your take on it?
Look, as we've just heard, it's been the Israelis are exercising enormous control over the flow of information out of Gaza. It's incredibly difficult for anyone who wasn't already based inside the region to get in there and to get any information out of it. What we've seen now is that airstrike on not just on the building that was housing the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, but 2 other media buildings last week. So that's 3 in total. Now, the Israelis have insisted that all of those buildings were targeted because Hamas was using them for intelligence gathering operations. But we haven't seen any evidence of that. The Associated Press CEO Gary Pruitt has called for the Israelis to show the evidence. The AP and Al Jazeera have both insisted that after years of operating out of those buildings and being very familiar with all of the residents in them, they have seen that they were certainly not aware of any Hamas presence. Now, that's not to say that it's impossible, but we need to see evidence of this, because in the absence of evidence, it's really hard to see this as anything other than a further attack by the Israeli authorities to control the flow of information coming out of Gaza. I'd say that if the Israelis are convinced that what they're doing in Gaza is proportionate and reasonable, then they will do all they can to help the media operate in the region and get straight information out of there.
Yeah, indeed. Hamas, Peter Greste, has been known to integrate itself into the community, but we have seen Israel with a very, for want of a better term, effective PR war when it comes to getting the West on board. Where is that at the moment? Is Israel losing that support?
I think it is. It's really hard to see the public opinion around the world turning behind Israel on this. Let's face it, the Israelis have all of the power. That's not to suggest that Hamas has no responsibility. Hamas, as you say, is integrated into the civilian population, but as we heard Dave Sharma speaking before the top of the hour, in a region that is as densely packed as Gaza, it's almost impossible for a military force to operate without bringing civilians into danger. Now, that, as I said, is not to suggest that they're not deliberately hiding them in places that are likely to put civilians at risk. But the fact is that the Israelis have vastly more power when it comes to airstrikes, when it comes to control over access to the Gaza Strip, when it has control over things like the economy and so on. And so with such an imbalanced conflict and with such an imbalance in the casualties, it's hard to see how Israel can win the media war in the way that if it continues to wage it in this way.
Yeah, look, the lopsided death toll is absolutely appalling. Israel maintains it is acting in self-defence against a group that has made no bones really in recent times about its wish to eliminate Israel as well. But I guess it comes down to this, Peter Greste. Can it really be described as self-defence?
Well, every time a rocket is fired out of Gaza, Israel is going to see that as an attack and is going to respond. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has said that they will continue to attack until calm is restored, though it's hard to see how continued attacks can restore calm in that way. You also need to understand, and I've worked out of Gaza, you need to understand the way in which Hamas also regards this as a form of self-defence, as an existential crisis. Yeah. Let's go back to what triggered this latest round of fighting in the first place. This was an attempt by the Israeli, a court case in a neighbourhood called Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, in which Palestinians were due to argue against being evicted under an Israeli law that gave Israelis the right to reclaim any properties that they'd lost before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Now, the Palestinians don't have an equivalent right of return. They don't have the capacity to insist that Israeli or Jewish citizens should be evicted from properties that they claim. And so what we're seeing is a microcosm, a small example of a much wider problem over land, over territory, and the way in which the Israeli government seems to be prioritising Jewish citizens at the expense of Palestinians. This is the kind of conflict that started to stir a lot of violence, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and triggered, really, I think, what has increasingly been a deep undercurrent of resentment, frustration and anger. So there is no doubt, and I've been in Gaza Strip, I've seen what it's like. I understand how the Palestinians feel. They feel as though they are marginalised, they are oppressed, they don't have the equal rights, they don't have the capacity to create a viable state, they don't have the capacity to create a viable economy. And so in that kind of environment, it's hard to see how the Palestinians would not react with the kind of violence that we're seeing.
Indeed, and it is a very difficult, complicated situation, has been there for decades in that part of the world. We've talked about the West and the role in this current intifada there that they might play, but what about neighbouring countries? Countries like Egypt used to play quite a critical role. Does it still now?
Well, we saw President Trump negotiate the Abraham Accords with a number of regional countries. Egypt has long had normalised relations with Israel, which has given it an opportunity to play the role as peace broker. But the problem is that it's becoming, this conflict has made it harder and harder for those states in the region who have tried to normalise relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords and other agreements, because of the way that their own publics are siding with the Palestinians. And so I think as the longer this conflict goes on, the harder it will be for those Arab states to continue to maintain those relationships with Israel. They will come under increasing pressure from their own populations to support the Palestinians. Now, let's face it, if that is continuing, it's easy to see why, at one level at least, there is a strategic value for Hamas in continuing the crisis, because the longer this pressure goes, the more support it will get right across the region.